Wonderful. Wonderful to see so many of you. Thank you for bringing the sun out for us, Jonas. That's very kind of you. Some enlightenment, I think, which I hope we will get more of later, of course. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Jonas Mago, who is that how you pronounce your last name? Is that close enough?
Fantastic.
Jonas is an amazing guy. I've had the pleasure of spending a lot of the weekend with him, walking around, talking about all the important things in life, which of course is really about flourishing, it's really about eudaimonia. And what you've come to us today is to talk about the kind of work that you've been doing for some time now. The kind of work thinking about how it is meditation may offer a door, some insights into this idea of flourishing. And in particular, I'm very excited to be hearing about the jhanas, because if it really is true that they exist, and we can catch them, as you've been trying to with various neuroimaging methods, we may be able to find the alphabet of well-being, as it were. These state could offer us pure forms of the kinds of things that we are forever trying to get. And so therefore, it's with great pleasure to welcome you here to the Center for Eudaimonia, and please tell us more. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. Maybe before I start the talk, a bit about me. I'm currently doing my PhD, DPhil, at McGill University, supervised by Michael Lifshitz, and co-supervised by Carl Friston. But much of what I will be talking about today is with a larger collaborative team. Some people are here. So my background is in neuroscience, philosophy, got quite into kind of computational modeling more recently. But then this is the other big part where, besides the science, I've been dabbling my feet in the practice world, try to meet people that do these Buddhist practices and other kind of practices of using attentional processes to modulate their own experience. And so today it's going to be a bit of a summary of talking about both the experiential and the kind of Buddhist side of things, as well as the neuroscience. But then, of course, your center looking at eudaimonia from a very non-doctrinal perspective. And then my kind of challenge and the inspiring thing about this talk is like, what's the well-being aspect here? Speaking to people that aren't bought in and like not based on these assumptions of what Buddhist practices kind of propose. So it's quite interesting to think about the underlying currents of well-being that's in these talks. What I just do here? Not about like this. Perfect. Okay. So much of what I will be talking about today is based on meditation, and I take much from the Theravadan tradition. Meditation is not only a Buddhist practice, meditation is practiced in all kinds of traditions, and within the Buddhist traditions there's many different streams, and one of them is the Theravadan stream, which is considered one of the oldest streams. And at its very core, Buddhist, and the word meditation comes from the Pali word bhavana, which means development. And it's often translated as meditation. And meditation for us is this thing of you sit down, you're silent. But at the end, it's not about the silence, not about sitting down. It's about the practice that allows you to develop how you perceive the world. And I think sitting down is one method, but I think it's important to keep in mind that this developing how you perceive the world is at its very center. As I said, practicing meditation is not limited to the followers of the Buddha and not to Buddhism, but practicing meditation is something broader, which comes up in other traditions. I will touch up on a few other traditions. And of course, even the Bodhisattva practiced under two teachers that taught him the jhanas. So the Buddha is also not the first one who ever encountered these jhanas. So there might be something to be said that jhanas might be more universal states that some people just encounter, but it's something that is not an invention of a single person. I think it's important to touch a bit up on some Buddhist terminology, because although I try to make it very broad of kind of think of mental development, these practices are in a Buddhist context. And in the Buddhist idea, there's this idea that there's dukkha. And broadly speaking, dukkha is unskillful action. It's the way how we think thoughts that aren't helpful, how we interact with others in ways that isn't beneficial to our own or other people's development. And now the Buddhist idea is that this eightfold path, there's this 8 things: right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, like developing a certain way of wholesome action, both internally and externally, that lead to way that offers like wholesome experiences, that allows a certain flourishing. And so that's the idea when we speak of development. How can we develop ways of being with ourselves and others that allows us to overcome the unskillfulness? And three of the core principles, and I'll take away the other thing around it, are these three terms, which is panya, samadhi, and shila. Samadhi is concentration, which we know of, like if you focus, often we focus on the nose, like you have your attention, which jumps around, and you try to concentrate it on a single object. Panya is wisdom, and shila is morality or virtue. We'll go into depth of all three of them. There's all kinds of different categorization of how you can cluster up meditation, and different scientists have taken different efforts. But in the classic Buddhist tradition, this threefold training is a very classical differentiation. And I think that's important when we go further down. I will focus more and more on the samadhi part, the concentration. And not only on samadhi, I will focus on a very specific type of samadhi, which is called Jhana Meditation, which I think is incredibly exciting. The phenomenology is incredibly rich. But we need to keep in mind that this is one part of a set of other things, which is meant to be understood, like the beneficial effects of that are understood in like this larger network of things. So let's start looking at what samadhi or concentration is. I think we all have this idea that when we speak of concentration meditation, and that's how I was taught for many years, that we have the breath and we focus on the breath. But in the most, like in the original Buddhist canon, they speak of 40 meditation objects. There are more now, but there's like 10 discs, which are like round objects that are like certain light objects of different colors. There's the 10 stages of the dead body, like different stages of disease, so that you get in contact with death, and that death is like part of what it means to be human. There's 10 recollections, which is recollecting Buddha nature, but this also includes things of like recollection of that there's an internal breath that is continuously ongoing. There's the 4 sublime states, which are the Brahma Viharas, which often be like there's loving kindness, like wishing well to ourselves and others. And there's a few more other categories. I will just briefly show you all 40 of them. I will just so like there's a whole bunch of meditation objects, and just so you're aware, like one of them is mindfulness of breathing, one of the 40 meditation objects. So when we go on, and I'll blur it out again because it's just distracting, it's a bit too much. There's mindfulness of breathing, but whatever I keep telling about now in these jhana states, you pretty much can use any of these 40 objects. None of what I talk about is specific to the breath. It's something specific for the quality of looking at the breath, but you have the same quality looking at other states. And that I think is quite exciting. Okay, so we said there's 40 objects on which you can possibly concentrate and more. And then we call this practice shamatha meditation. Shamatha is the type of meditation that gives you samadhi, and samadhi is, simply put, very good concentration. And the reason we do that is we can then do another practice which is called vipassana meditation, which is a specific type that gives you panya, which is insight. And maybe I should kind of bracket this. I'm not a Buddhist scholar. I don't understand these words myself, nor am I'm a teacher teaching these things. So this is just my best understanding of having spoken to many of these people. And then there is, you see in the top right, there's Shaila Catherine and Park Sayadaw and Sayadaw Kandadana. These are teachers that have taught me this particular way of splitting things up. So maybe that's a note of reference. Okay, so we said there's one practice which is concentrating the mind, and once the mind is concentrated, then you can do this vipassana thing, which is then using it in skillful ways. And the concentration, again, the Buddhists, they love numbers, can be split in 3 parts. There's preliminary or momentary concentration, there's access concentration, and there's absorption or jhana concentration. And so the important thing here just to note is most of what I'll be talking about today is in this very last stage, which is we're in the kind of concentration space, and then we're in the very, very deep concentration space. That's a bit kind of just meant to orient. And then this is something that if you kind of reach these deep concentration states, the byproduct that comes with it is a certain thing, which is a meditation sign, which is called a nimitta, which is often understood as a byproduct that if your concentration is very sharp, there's a certain kind of light appearing. I will have a beautiful illustration of that later on. But again, this is an overview that the idea is the more you concentrate, the more of kind of a clear light there is. And the clear light is interesting because in psychiatry, right, if you think of depression treatment, you sometimes speak of seeing the bright light at the other side of the tunnel or coming out. So there's this like very experiential language of speaking about light and brightness. And the most extreme might be here a certain type of meditation where this light is just like pretty much taking up all your conscious experience for moments of experience. I wasn't so sure if I include this next part, but I think I should do it, which shamatha meditation is the story I told so far is a story that I heard very often speaking about people here in the Western world. But then I've recently spent time in India, in Thailand, Cambodia, and spoke with Buddhist monks there. And they have a very clear list of what they think the benefits of these shamatha meditation is. It's a blissful abiding in the here and now, which I think is just like being present. It's a proximate cause for insight meditation, which basically means there's something to be learned. With sharp concentration, there's something to be learned. It's the basis for supernatural power. I'll say what that is in a second. You can be reborn in the Brahma world, and you can attain cessation, which is the complete fading of experience. Which, if you buy into this starting point that there's dukkha, that there's suffering, then the fading of experience is a beautiful thing. But this is interesting, and this is something that was quite challenging for me being in these Asian countries where tapping in these states, there are states that are very hard to make meaning of. Basically, that they're states where a lot of conceptual meaning making that we have is dropping. And then you come out of these states and you try to understand what has happened in this time when experience was very different. And the old Asian scripts and even the teachers today sometimes talk of these supernormal powers that emerge as like the divine ear, that you can hear things far, far away. Knowledge of others' minds, which is basically mind reading, that by looking at you, I could read your mind, or even if you're at a different place, I could read your mind. Recollection of past lives, so sometimes called past life regression, that I can look into other people's past lives. The divine eye, that I can look through solid objects. And the knowledge of the eradication of traits, which basically means that there's just so that there's no sensual desire, no kind of attachment to existence, no wrong view, no ignorance. I think there's one conversation about these things, of what they mean and like the metaphysics of our universe. And that might be an interesting conversation. But there's another conversation, like what does this tell us about the experience of the human mind? And I think one thing we can take from this is there seem to be ways of how we can perceive reality that is very different to how most of us experience reality. Maybe that is because of a different cultural context, or maybe this is due to certain practices that fundamentally alter how we relate and perceive reality around us. And so no matter what it is, I think one of the core takeaways of this jhana meditation is our perception of reality can be fundamentally altered to how we usually perceive things. And speaking of magic or these superhuman powers, it's kind of, I think, one way that kind of hints towards this. That's the samadhi. And then the panya, we don't talk much about it, but I think for completeness, it's important to speak about it. There's the idea that the world is made up of mentality, of materiality. So there's like the experience of the world, there's the world itself. And then there are these three things, anicca, dukkha, and anatta, which is impermanent suffering or non-self, which is basically certain characteristics of these things that that people in these traditions are encouraged to experience. And then there's a certain way of how these things relate, and that's considered insight. I think it's an incredibly interesting question, but we leave that away for today, and we will focus on the shamatha part, because I think that's the part that's for us, or like for me as more like a cognitive scientist, I think we have a much better grasp on like what these attentional processes are, and then we can build up from there. And then the third thing, which we also don't touch on too much today, but which I think is so important to keep in mind, is this idea of shila, which is wisdom, or like more like ethical conduct, virtue. And the important thing is that being a virtuous man is often considered a requirement to even go into these states. The idea is, if you lie, if you steal, if you have like unwholesome human actions, there's so much like regret, fear, whatever that is in you, that you aren't even able to relax and enter these states. So developing good shila, good ethics, is a requirement to enter them. But it's also the end. The reasons why do you do all this practice? It's to develop a good ethical life afterwards. So shila is not only the beginning, but the end. So it's kind of encompassing the other two. And it's something that many people in Asia, they say, I don't meditate. I'm still practicing my shila. I still try to live an ethical, wholesome life. And it's something that here in the Western world doesn't take such a center stage. I think we're very impressed if we do these jhanas, but what's our conversation around like how we actually act, what kind of friends we are. And then also for terms of completeness, there's alternative categorization. There's Antoine Lutz, and they have this famous distinction between the attentional family, the deconstructive and the constructive family. Where attentional qualities are a bit like what I talked about these jhanas, that you focus on something, you're really good at focusing. Deconstruction is a sort of like fading of experience, which interestingly jhanas also have a certain quality of. And constructive would be considered the Brahma Viharas of bringing about certain loving kind qualities. And then this is a similar object, right? You have this, how object-oriented things are, the de-reification, the meta-awareness. This is like coming from cognitive scientists trying to understand what are the qualities, how the human mind works. And so addictive and craving would be one where it's like the objects are very oriented. There's like a specific drug or specific cigarette or specific whatever. It's not de-reified, so it seems like very real, like this is like that it like really exists. And there's very little meta-awareness, so you're not even aware that you're doing it. And then the other extreme would be some sort of open monitoring. You don't focus on an object, you're aware of your whole experiential field. It's de-reified, so you don't only perceive the objects, but you perceive objects more as like phenomena, and you're aware of this perceptual process. I think these are incredibly helpful approaches. But again, I think for today, we focus on the Shila, Panya, Samadhi distinction, which is kind of from the Theravadan tradition, aligns more with the practitioners we've been working with. And then Shamil suggested another, like a similar three-dimensional grid with certain deconstruction, de-reification, the content of phenomenal, or like how much the phenomenal content is reduced, and the third dimension, which is the non-duality of experience. So there's many different ways of how we can kind of cut these things up. That might be really, really interesting when we start thinking about the neurophysiological patterns underlying these states, because that depends like what patterns do we look at. But that's the one we're gonna go with for today. So that was a really long cycle to think about like what is jhana meditation, what is in these scriptures. Now in the second part, we're going to actually look into the specific jhana type. So this is the overview. You know, there's concentration inside. Concentration has different depths. And at the very deep end, there's something called, which is jhana meditation. One of the most famous jhana teachers is Park Sayadaw. And he has this book, The Practice, which leads to Nibbana. It has 2 or 3 parts. And he has a few teachers that are teaching in the Western world. The one that I know and have worked with a bit is Shaila Catherine, She is authorized to teach in Park Sayadaw. There's other people. There's Tina Rasmussen, Stephen Snyder, Machia Rose, like all these people. They've trained with Park Sayadaw. So it's a tradition that has come to us, to the Western world a bit. And so these teach a certain type of jhana, which we could call the Visuddhimagga jhanas, which have this quality of the light that emerges, the nimitta. It's the very deep end. But there's other people. There's John Yates or Chula Dasa. There's someone called Rocco Bayer, a UK-based teacher. There's Michael Taft, and there's Lee Brasington. And again, there's even other teachers. And they also teach a type of jhana. And that's, it's a terminology that Lee Brasington came up with. They call them Sutta jhanas, which are also jhanas. But here, the basic question is your concentration gets better and better. And you need to make a cutoff line. So concentration is kind of a linear things, different experiences happen, and where do you make the cutoff line of like, this is jhana and this is not jhana? And here the big thing is that the people on the left, the Sutta jhanas, they say like, as soon as your concentration is not wiggling as much anymore and is somewhat stable, and there's a certain experience of joy and equanimity rising in that, we call that jhana. While like more kind of the Park Sayadaw tradition, they would say, well, these are kind of preliminary signs of jhana, but now you need to deepen that until like a certain, like there's another shift coming where you like where other experiences are not only in the background, but other experiences completely fade. And there's the nimitta. So it's just a distinction of how deep these jhanas are. And I think there is a lot of value from all these different approaches, probably for different people, for different kind of practice contexts. You want to integrate them, right? There's other practices. And in our work, we've worked mostly with people from this Park Sayadaw Shaila Catherine study, which is a type of jhana. Well, these are probably accessible to most people that practice meditation, and if you have the right teaching instructions, you can get into them after a couple of years. These are some that might not even be accessible to anyone, where there might be a certain, like, you need to just have the right makeup, you need to have the right training, and some even say you need to have years of retreats to even be able to enter these jhanas. So how do I come to this? Over the past year or so by now, I spent a lot of time with talking with Shaila Catherine and other jhana practitioners. And we've been at a 10-day meditation retreat with Shaila Catherine in Arizona, in North America. And so she invited 10 of her most senior jhana practitioners. Right now you have the most senior teacher, and now she invites the most kind of experienced practitioners. And we've done a study there where for a 10-day meditation retreat, we did it on a retreat because these states at home, it's hard to get into, so you need a few days to ramp up. And so we went there, collected a bunch of questionnaires, neurophysiological data, did a bunch of cognitive tasks, and to figure out what's happening in these deep states. And now this past December and January, I've been in India and in Thailand and Cambodia, and we worked with monks, but also with lay people, and asked them to enter deep concentration states. With monks, one of the challenges is that they have the Vinaya, which is the ethical conduct. So it's hard for them to speak about whether they go into jhana or not, and what type of jhana, because as soon as you speak about the experience, you break a certain ethical conduct. There might be a few ways around it to still collect meaningful data. But then there's lay practitioners who also practice these states very, very deeply. And so the kind of models that I will present in the next few slides, we haven't analyzed the data yet. So I would love to come back in a year and present actual data. And the exciting thing is that like Morten, Len, and this team, they have this beautiful whole brain models. I think that's very exciting. So what I try to do now is to pitch theoretical modeling ideas of what I think is going on in these jhanas, how that links to the Bayesian kind of brain hypotheses of how perception works. And then that hopefully leads into some interesting analyses. And so these models are inspired by conversations with these people, are inspired by things, how they talk about it, also observing them, how they practice, and by some quotes of both North America and Asian people. I was a bit debating how much math I should put into this talk. I feel like this is the place I can put in a bit of math. And also thought I just steal a few ideas from Shamil's talk that he gave you a little while ago. So I would summarize the Bayesian perception problem in like a slide or two. But if you haven't seen Shamil's talk, go and check that out. There's a whole talk on pretty much this topic. So there's stuff out there in the world. We have little rows here. And then there's us somewhere in the world. And the big question is, how does the rose get into our eyes and from our eyes into our head? And how are we able to perceive what's out there in the world? Problem is that the data that we get in through our retina is incredibly messy, and there's just no direct access to the rose. So we have like some pixels, some neuronal activity. Now we need to decode how does neuronal firing relate to objects out there in the world. Long story short, math helps us to figure out what's the optimal solution, and there's something called the Bayes theorem. And so basically on the left side there, you see the posterior distribution, which for the purpose of this talk, we can consider the posterior as the inference, the inferred perception, and which is probably the mathematically the closest thing to actual experience, arguably consciousness. And then on the right-hand side, you have the likelihood of the data, the prior and the marginal probability. All these are basically assumptions that you have about how the world works, about the mechanics of the world out there. How often are certain experiences happening? How likely is it to see a rose here? Now, it's springtime, so it might become more and more likely. If it were 2 months ago and there were winter, probably a bit unlikely to see such a red rose outside. How it works is that there is a cause of perception, there's an observation, something that reaches our eyes. Now we try to use this observation to form a certain recognition density or posterior. Now, there is a bunch of math behind it. I think I'll leave it away for today's talk. But the important thing is we don't only infer objects out there in the world, but we infer all kinds of other things, like proprioception, where our body is, our heartbeat, what we hear. Some of these things we infer consciously. I think if you just tune in and start to notice your belly, you can do that pretty good. But there's a whole bunch of inferences that happen on the subconscious level that you do, but you're not crazy aware of it. But the big problem is there's also all kinds of other things that we infer. There's like emotions, there's phones, there's food, there's games, there's sexuality, there's work or finals that we have to do. So all these things are also kind of going on in our perceptual streams. And all these things are things we try to kind of monitor as well, try to like think like how can we optimize them, like how can we get pleasure out of food, and then like there's a whole load of things that we might try to figure and navigate in our environment. And while they are the posterior, we would love to have the posterior just being the rose. Like imagine a pure perception of rose. There's like nothing else in experience but the beautiful image of a rose. But there's a whole, like, it's just cluttered with all these other things as well. As soon as they're in our head as priors, as expectations, as soon as we expect these things to exist, they start to influence our perceptual system. And what would it take for these things to kind of be a bit pushed to the side so that the rose, the posterior, can take a bit more space? And somehow what we believe from work that many people here have done or people in the field is that the solution to this might lay in the likelihood, the prior, and the marginal. So that the idea is like some of this trick may lay in the mechanisms that we use to infer and make meaning of the world, the meaning making. As said, check out Shamil talk for a longer version. I do, however, do one more slide because now the question is how would we be able to optimize this at all? So again, we infer that there's a rose out there, and now we do something which is called generative modeling. Now what we basically do is, if it would really be a rose out there, what would we expect to perceive? So now we have the estimated cause, which is not the real thing out there, but our inferred cause. We simulate if it were a rose, what would we expect to see? we have the estimated perceptual data. Then we can contrast the perceptual data with the estimated data, and we get something which is called a prediction error. We can compare the estimated cause from our inferred cause of the data, which gives us some kind of, again, a distribution of like how different these two things are. And basically it tells us how good are we in navigating this environment, how good are we inferring what's out there, and we can use that to update our generative model. And the generative model is our internal hypotheses of the mechanics of the world. And so what I hope to do now is to think about, how does jhana help us to update this model of the world? How can we use attentional guided processes to refine this? Because all of this, like the prediction error and free energy updating of the generative modeling, how it's displayed in the literature is often that there is like an optimal way of doing it. And so we usually have these models, we look at what's optimal mathematically, and that's how it works, which leads to this rather unified framework of how it works. But apparently, if we look at like there's certain clinical populations, certain people doing these practices, there seems to be a way of refining it. There seems to be an art in doing this. So again, we have the rose, we have the percept, nothing cluttered at all. And so this is what we hope to reach in the end. And here's one quote. I have a few quotes spread throughout, and these might be little poetry moments almost. One of the jhana practitioners, after coming out of jhana, said, after a retreat, "Yes, I looked at a water drop at a pear tree, and I couldn't believe how incredibly beautiful this was. The world seemed more joyful and sharp after jhana. In the jhana, it's like I've gone into a tunnel, a contained experience that's separate from conventional reality." And then she comes out, and a pure water drop is just bringing this beautiful light and joy into her life. And so somehow her kind of inferential process must have done the affordance to perceiving things beautiful. And so this is just a representation. It's more and more common in the field of having a certain triangle, which is like our priors, our assumptions of the world influence what we perceive. Now the question is, how do we set our priors? And it turns out that setting up priors is another inferential process. And how do we set up those priors? Well, it's another inferential process. So there's this big pyramid of inferential processes. And so basically, we could say that this is a way of looking at the world. This terminology is taken from Rob Beyer, a beautifully poetic meditation teacher. And now, what are possible ways of looking at the world? We can perceive the world as anxiety-inducing. Like imagine walking around and everything you see is meant to harm you. You could see the world as being painful and depressing, as something that's intended to like put us down. Or we could have this idea of trying to perceive the world as true or accurate. Like what would it mean to perceive this model really as what it is and don't put any overlay on top of it? But maybe we can push it a bit further. What if we try to perceive the world as empowering? That this is not just a bottle, but this is something that like is meant to hold water for me, that I can drink of this, and because I can drink, I can talk, and that's pretty cool. Or the last one is to perceive it beautiful. Like what would it take to go through the world and perceive objects as like a form of art, of beauty, that is meant for us to evoke a certain experience, and seeing that as something quite magical. And who knows if this is aligned with all traditions, but what if insight would mean that it's the mastering of the art of looking, that insight, this kind of goal of meditation, this goal of development. What if the goal of development is to master the way how we perceive the world, that we can decide whether we want to see the world as true, as painful, as empowering, or as beautiful. So what would it take to see things as beautiful? And one of the ways how we think about it in the modeling side, I speak about it a bit more specifically, but there's other people that have developed this in much more math. What would it mean to let go of a certain grip? Because in terms of starting to see things as beautiful, we first need to be able to let go of the idea that everything around us is meant to harm us, to induce anxiety. And then what does it mean to let go of that? Or let go of more assumptions, the things we see, how they are, or like this whole hierarchy. There's so many assumptions that we use in looking at the world. And there's a few quotes that underlie this. They're from Rob, where he says, happiness depends on jhana, and jhana depends on happiness. Where apparently a certain jhana practice that is doing something like this, we look at it a bit more in a second, but jhana practice that is making experiential processes transparent in some way, is inducing joy. But joy is also the condition that to get into these jhanas, this beautiful codependence. There's the idea of piti, which is like a certain energy that arises in these jhanas. And he says, see if it can spread. See if you can get the whole body involved, touch, enjoying it. So you're not just a passive observer in these meditations. There's this encouragement, which is like an invitation to play with experiential qualities. And then finally, which is one of the most beautiful quotes, I think, trust your experience, but keep refining your view. Like, trust in what you perceive, have confidence in that, but still play with this way of mastering the art of looking. Is there another way of how we can perceive the world in more subtlety? And the central question is, what concepts and assumptions are we unwilling to challenge? Like, maybe we're okay to accept that certain people that we consider wanting to do us harm, that they might just not know how to do better, that we can do forgiveness. But what about assumptions of that there is a time passing by? What about the assumption that you and me, that we're not even different, that maybe we're one? What about the assumption that I don't even exist? And what does that do with perception? Again, there's the kind of metaphysical question, but like there's this experiential part of what does it do with how we perceive the world? And just before this presentation, Morten was so cool to share this little blob, which I think is just visually illustrating this idea. See if you can, if you see what it is, maybe don't say it, but see if you can figure out what's on that photo. And now I will show you this. Now let's go back. Has it changed? Does the perception of this black dot is different? And the idea here is that by having a certain knowledge of what the underlying image is, by having a certain prior assumption, we start to perceive these black dots that are kind of meaningless at first, start to perceive them as something meaningful, meaning-making. And what if it's the same process in all kinds of other perceptual modes? And current trend in the neuroscience and cognitive sciences is that maybe most of perception is a bit of such a process. And in this case, it might be incredibly beautiful because knowing what these apes are, you can actually see the apes. But what if not all the assumptions that we hold about the world are actually so helpful? What if you're in a certain depressed or anxious mood and have certain assumptions that the world is meant to harm you? How does it change your experience? And maybe Tim Flach, I think is how you pronounce it. He's the one who made these images, and so a big shout out to him for sharing them to Morten. Okay. So we had this idea that we perceive the world. We have this kind of nested generative hierarchy of how we see the world. And there's different ways of how we can model it. One thing that I think is quite pleasing, not sure if it's quite accepted, but it's a paper with Fernando that we recently submitted, should come out soon. It's this idea that there's certain attractor landscapes. There's different ways of, like, different states by which we can experience the world. There's certain attractor states, and there's certain configurations that are very stable configurations of how we experience the world. And now you see the ball needs to climb up this huge hump to get from one experiential point to the other. This doesn't have any kind of characterization of how good these attractors are, but assume that this one is a certain, like, unhelpful, painful perception of the world, and that this one is a certain beautiful, wholesome experience of the world. And now what you want to do is, how can you make the transition between one state and the other easier or more difficult? And the idea is that if you could somehow flatten this thing, that this hump is just not as big anymore, that'd be kind of cool, that the new attractor states are not as strongly attracting. In the psychedelic state, we sometimes speak about this kind of, like there's this rebus model, a few other models, where the idea is that we kind of, like it's almost like the brain, we can just mold the brain a bit like metal, that can be formed in new ways. So that's a bit the kind of rough analogy. So how can we transition between different perceptual modes a bit more easy? And what we will see in a second is that while psychedelics are probably doing it by introducing a whole bunch of noise in the system, which allows you to kind of randomly jump from state to state a bit more easily, what I suggest in a bit is that jhana meditation is doing something very different with a very similar effect. And I also say that it's doing something very different than other types of meditation. Because here is one of the, there's this kind of two models. There's one by Lars Sandwich Smith and one by Ruben Laukonen. And so this model basically says that there's like the blue, the orange, and the green, that there's different nested hierarchies, and that on each on them, like a bit like the triangles that are stacked, that you kind of set the prior assumptions for each hierarchy on the next higher level. And then this little thing, which is our assumptions, like at different parts of the model, like here representing these A matrices, that hold certain assumptions of how the world works. And by training the precision, by becoming better in modulating the precision in this hierarchy, we can become like fine-tuning the inferential processes of how we look at the world. And then here, there's a bit of a like similar idea, also in the predictive processing space, but a bit more linear, the idea that we have this inferential hierarchy. Out here, there would be the kind of these many pyramids that were at the very end of what I stacked. At the very center, there's like the core pyramid of like the core perceptual experiences that we have. And here the idea is that also like the further out, the more conceptual, the more abstract, the more like conceptual beliefs we have about how to infer the world. And as shown with this image in the ape, these kind of conceptual ideas influence the moment-to-moment kind of perception. So how's jhana meditation different or similar? And but I think what I'll do, I thought maybe I'd do a guided meditation, but I think maybe that's not the perfect way. So I thought to use like visual symbols to illustrate a certain way of how these jhana meditations may feel. Illustrating it in images might not fully get there, but it might be first estimation. So take it as a little trial. There's a cup out there in the world, and we try to observe it. How would we observe it? Well, we look at it. But again, as in the image before, when we look at something, there's certain emotions going on. We're aware of the space surrounding us. We're aware of laws of gravity, that the cup is standing. It would be really weird if the cup were flying in the middle of the air. We're aware of people around us. Maybe they watch us. Maybe there's something like, what does it mean to us to look at this cup? We're aware of time, and we're aware of causal dynamics, of like certain things the cup can and cannot do. The cup can fall and can break into pieces, but the cup couldn't I don't know, the cup probably couldn't reassemble as a cup if it were broken in pieces. And so I give you the instruction to focus on the cup, but what's probably happening is that you focus on all these other things. The attention is jumping around pretty wildly. And in between, it comes back to the cup, but most of the time, the attention is somewhere on these other things, and then comes back to the cup, and you're like, yep, I've been paying attention to the cup. It was an awareness at this point, and it was here, so clearly that's attention. But what would it mean if all these other things were shifted a bit to the outside, and this cup takes up a bit more space in awareness? Like, what would it mean if attention still wiggles a little bit, but if attention comes back to the cup a bit more often and moves a bit faster? What would it take if even my act of looking at this cup goes a bit into the background, when I'm not even so aware of perceiving the cup anymore, but if the cupness takes over experience? What if there's only the cup, and the cup taking up more and more space in experience? What if the cup takes up so much experience that it's not even a cup anymore, but there's only a certain quality of cupness? And as I shared at the very beginning, if attention is at this stage where you're so focused, and this is only happening in this very deep jhanas, probably not in these more sutta jhanas, what if there's so much cupness that there's a certain light emerging out of this cupness? In fact, so much light that there's not even a cupness, but only light, that you're immersed in this light. There's not even a doer who's doing this light. There's not even intention of doing it. Like all these things you left stages ago. And now you're in this kind of bright lightness. And that's the state when the jhana practice begins. So you see that jhana practice is nothing that's like the first practice you do, right? There's this whole lineup that you need to do to even start the jhana practice. And now we can start to think about these beautiful refined stages that I would probably expect that these are some of the most refined states of consciousness that are accessible to the human experiences, the clearest states that are out there. And the nice thing is they're very clearly separated between different types of jhana. There's jhana 1, which is characterized by vitakka, vichara, piti, and sukha, where vitakka is the coming in contact with an object. In this case, it would be the bright light, the nimitta. And the vichara is staying in touch with it. Once the bright light is there, once in touch with it, the vichara is that you don't lose it anymore. Another analogy is if you hit a gong, you hit it, that's the vitakka, and then you kind of move the little thing around and kind of sustains the sound, that's the vichara. And once you do this, there's the piti and the sukha. And the piti and the sukha, it's like, sukha is sometimes translated as certain like joy, and piti is like, sometimes it's like sukha, joy, happiness, piti is certain like rapturous joy. Like piti is very very intense at points. People describe it, sometimes they say like, it's so intense in my bones, it rips my bones apart, which is pretty intense. And sukha is much more like, but it feels really good. It's a really nice feeling. And so somehow the mixture of the two make up the first jhana. And then once that is very stable, you can let go of the contact with this nimitta. You don't need to be in touch with an object anymore. You just have the piti and the sukha. And also I should say, different traditions split these up in different ways. So like sometimes like there's subtle differences, but the general trajectory is the same. So now in the second jhana, there's only this rapturous joy and a certain kind of sukha, a certain kind of happiness. And then the third jhana, this rapturous thing fades. The experience is often, well, when you first come in touch with it, this rapturous feeling is, it's overwhelming. It's the most beautiful experience that these people had ever experienced. And there's a certain form of people getting attached to these feelings. So if you practice it more and more, you notice it's very energy consuming. It's like imagine falling in love, and you fall in love, and this beautiful feeling, you feel like you never want to let go of this again. And then like a few weeks in, or months in, or years in, you're like, but it would be so nice to just chill an evening on my own and just have a bit of space and relax. It's a very like, it's a weird analogy, but like something in that space I think is somewhat accurate. And then this kind of rapturous feeling fades. There's the softness, the sukha, the joy. But then what you notice, even joy, it takes so much energy to be happy all the time. What would it take to let go of that? And then there's that should be the fourth jhana. There's a fourth jhana, which is just equanimity. And now we're at this space where there's not even rapturous joy or sukha, it's just equanimity, you're just okay. And you're not okay about the bottle, or about the people, or about the presentation, because there's no bottle or people or presentation, it's just equanimity. So that's the first four, and then it goes deeper. Then there's infinite space, where space fades, infinite consciousness, where like consciousness, like it's not you having consciousness, there is just consciousness everywhere. And then even the consciousness fades, and there's no thingness, not even consciousness. Like how do you even think of that? And then if you think that no consciousness is kind of wild, what would it mean if there would be not consciousness, And that's a state when we're at neither perception or non-perception. So the idea here is we have this stacked hierarchy, right? There's this idea that we have all these assumptions that we bring, and we start from the last thing. Of course, there's perception. That's like a thing that we, like, if we look in the world, we experience. And of course, there's stuff in the world. There's thingness because we experience things. And of course, there's consciousness because we're conscious of experiencing them. And of course, there's space because we experience stuff in space. And that goes down further and further until we have the assumption how things work, how social interactions work. And if we trust these reports, then all these things that we take as so materially real are in fact not as given as we might think. And then the thing is that there's ekagita, which is like one-pointedness, that whatever these states I talked about, this is the only thing in consciousness. This is like in the Sutta jhanas, it's a bit different. In the Sutta jhanas, you can have like the infinite consciousness can be the dominant perceptual phenomena that you have, but there can be other stuff in the background. But the ekagita, that this is the only thing in experience that distinguishes the two things. And now this is already pretty a long cycle, but it's not quite where things stop at this very end. Upala. Sometimes it's considered the ninth jhana. There's something which is called cessation. So now we have the fading of things, so there's nothing anymore. Then there's not even nothing anymore, and even that thing stops at some point. And that's really interesting, I think, and hard, I think, to convey in words, to convey in experience. So when we think of meditation, right, we have this beautiful thing that we meditate, and all these things that impinges us on the world around us. There's just this beautiful globe, and we're held by it, and the world is just outside. And I think that's what these jhanas can do, and that's, I think, the idea of what meditation can do. But as said, sometimes jhanas are like this. Sometimes jhanas aren't this quiet, protected space. Sometimes jhanas are these things where we like explode the universe and where it's kind of pretty intense. And I would just like to share a quote of what one of our practitioners said. And again, take these poetries as a bit of, did I say poetry already? Take this quote as a bit of poetry. Well, the beauty of poetry is that it evokes a certain feeling, and maybe you can feel what he meant by this. He said, "In jhana, your body can shake. When I first got it, I felt like I was choking, that my breath was rapid. I felt more rapid and I thought, oh my goodness, I can't go. Something is making me nervous and making me feel anxious. I back off. I'm not going there. I don't know what the other side is like. I started to get closer to the edge and I got over that shaking eventually. It's not just this shaking, but it's a physical sense of overcoming. And at the same time, almost instantaneously, after that, is just the sense of total happiness. My goodness, that is really very pleasant." So that's also another phase transition. That's the prerequisite for jhana. And then, when you get the nimitta, you get another one of those. And that physical sense of being pulled in. It's not an emotion, it's not a sensation. It just feels like suddenly you're going from 0 to 100 miles an hour without feeling gravity, without feeling acceleration, but you're there. It's like a whoosh and you're in. You do get some physical sensation. Your body twitches, your head twitches. Usually it's been arms and shoulders or head, but it's not an emotion. The quality of this state gets better if your body twitches. And so this very high arousal experience is not unique to jhana meditation. There's certain Aboriginal countries, I think if you think of ayahuasca is often given with certain music and ceremonial settings. in the church, there's the idea of like being possessed by God's Spirit, and you kind of speak through God's Spirit. Tanya Lerman, and with whom Michael Lifshitz, my supervisor, has worked a lot. She's been exploring a lot this idea where people feel like it's a very similar experience where they feel like they're out of control, they was like taken over by God. There's the psychedelic experience where the world and shapes just start to seem weird. And there is in the Sufi tradition, they distinguish between drunken and sober practices. And the drunken practices are like, think of this whirling, you just whirl around and you just get all dizzy. And that's when you get closest to God. So there's all these traditions where you get closer to God by getting into this really intense experiential states. And I think that's interesting because we so often think of contemplation as this thing of like silencing the mind and staying very far away from intensity. Maybe that's good. Maybe it's good that we don't overload our nervous system. But what if at some points this intensity actually has certain affordances, certain values? And I think it's the last part of this presentation. I will go through a bit of a modeling idea of how I think that this intensity leads to this ability of changing transitions. Again, we have this idea that there's, that there's a rose, that you perceive the rose. We have the posterior distribution, and then the observations and priors, our makeup, they determine how we see the world. And if we want to kind of display it visually, we have the observation, that's the data that's impinging on our eyes. We have the priors, that's the assumptions that we hold looking at the world. And those kind of together, they form a posterior distribution. And I showed you this earlier. The idea is that there's certain attractors, you can see it here, right? Like there's some lines that seem to pull you a bit more, like if you've seen the lower lines when you're pulled there. Or we could do the other way around. Assume that high lines, I think it's better for what's coming. That high lines is like more likelihood of being there. And it's kind of hard to jump from these high points because there's like lower points in between. And you want to be able to transition a bit more easily, that you can be a bit more playful with perception. So how do psychedelics do it? And again, it's kind of, it's more like an analogy. I think it might be more interesting to stimulate discussions afterwards. So the idea is that psychedelics probably introduce a bit of noise, that you kind of move back and forth between different observations and priors. You have a bit more noise in the visual system that introduces some noise in the data that's coming in. Your priors, there's probably a bit of noise in the more cortical regions. And at some point, the whole system just starts to shake around a little bit. And once the system starts to shake, you see in your posterior distribution, you kind of just jump from different high points to different high points, which I think can be incredibly therapeutic if you think that you're stuck in a certain state. It might be depression or anxiety, or like a certain like state of like not fulfillment in a way. And psychedelics kind of shake you up a bit. You might be able to cultivate other states by just randomly being thrown there. I think there's, and it's an interesting one because more and more my suggestion or my intuition is that psychedelics may actually do a bit more than this, that they facilitate certain attractor states. But so far, most of the psychedelic work has been like shaking you out of certain attractors. But what meditation seems to do is that meditation seems in your observation, by focusing your concentration on few objects, you have a few objects that stick out a little bit more. There might be the breath or certain parts of your body experience, so observation becomes a bit more salient. At the same time, you train your prior, you train your expectation to pick out some of these objects a bit more. And in consequence, this leads to the posterior distribution being a bit more stable. And so while this becomes a bit more stable, you also notice all the other states that you could experience become a bit more equalized. And I think the reason why that is that there's probably some sort of normalization going on in the brain, that if some things become much more salient, you normalize it in some sense, and then if some things kind of, if these ramp up, then you normalize the whole thing. So the difference between these other states becomes a bit smaller. But that's just normal concentration meditation. But then we talked about the phenomenology of jhana meditation. So how is jhana meditation different here? And here the idea is that now the interesting thing is that the posterior influences the prior. The observation becomes more salient. I think that's something that's true about any type of meditation. As soon as I start to focus on the breath, I have a stronger prior that the next mind moment I have is also going to be the breath. But this is the thing that I think is different in jhana, that the posterior influences the observation, that the observer and the observation are coupled. Because usually when I focus on the breath or something out there in the world, my breath doesn't change much if I get more concentrated. Maybe it gets a bit more subtle. But now in jhana, the idea is that we focus on this light, this nimitta or the piti. And the beautiful, interesting thing is that this is a mind-created object. One of the core instructions of how Srila Catherine teaches jhana, and so does Payak Sayadaw, is you cannot focus on your breath if you want to get into these deep jhanas, because your breath is too coarse. It has too much sensory data. What you want to have is a phenomenon that is so soft, so smooth, that your mind doesn't even like, that it's not like, it's just like smooth and stable, that is like a continuous vichara, continuous contact. And the idea here is that this is much, much easier if you're in touch with a mind-generated object. And that's why this nimitta is so central, because it's a mind-generated light, and so is the piti and the sukha. These are kind of internally generated experiences. And all of these start to ramp up once your concentration is stable. And if you now put your concentration on these objects, they're incredibly pleasant experiences. Because they're pleasant, they start to attract the attention much more. Now you're even more concentrated, because there's this pulling going on. Because you're more concentrated, that's more pleasant, so there's more piti, more nimitta, more sukha arising. If there's more, it attracts your mind even more. And then there's this interesting kind of pull going on. So while in meditation we had some concentration, now the observation becomes more and more centered. There's like a more and more clearly defined object. Your expectation becomes more and more refined, because there's more and more moments where you experience only this object. So the expectation of perceiving these other objects becomes smaller and smaller. And that leads to the posterior distribution being more and more stable. And it probably doesn't only happen once, but happens so many times that at some point there's only one object. And I think that's what we could call an absorption state. And there's a few quotes, the short ones, that people say about this. You can take it as poetry if you like. They say, it takes a lot of determination, it takes a lot of effort to get the mind concentrated enough so it's alert to go into jhana. It always takes effort, even within a sit. It takes effort to set up the mind for the pulling. But once it pulls, I only need to step back and to let it go. Sometimes it doesn't take effort anymore. Another person said, it's that wonderful sense of letting go of everything. What's left is that sense of bliss or contentment, tremendous happiness. And some people, this experience, and I think this is where some of the intensity comes from, even get too much joy, where they say, the joy tends to get out of bounds. It's intense, it's enough, I want it to stop. So it's like an experience where, again, like we often try when we speak about like well-being to get happy, to be joyful, but now we have states that have even too much of that. So now we need to have the remedy of how you get out of that. Okay, so that's the idea, but then that's probably when you get into the first jhana. But then what you probably realize, you probably can't see it now. There's like many, many different lines. You need is that even this jhana object is kind of composed of all these different things. And then you start to focus on some specific ones. So even more experience fade in the background, and you kind of refine this thing more and more. And now the interesting thing to just notice, while I kind of illustrate the idea that a certain posterior distribution becomes more and more salient, you see that the distribution of all other posteriors is pretty much flat. And that's the beautiful moment where now you can kind of transition between these states very, very fluently. And that's where probably some of the difficulty in jhana comes from, where Right, like basically you don't experience these things anymore. And one of the things you don't experience is, for example, the breath. And so there's 3 quotes here talking about the challenges that now come. Probably do something like this. They say, the breath disappears. I worry that I don't breathe. Someone else says, some difficulty can arise in the formless jhanas. When staying too long in formless jhanas, that's like 5 to 8, the capacity to think clearly after emergence can be lost. I couldn't process normal things without unbelievable headaches. But that doesn't happen often in the first 4 jhanas. And then last quote here. Early on, I had some experiences when I woke up into an unfamiliar mind state. I felt afraid. It was more in the beginning. Sometimes I would wake up into a state of disorientation. This lasted seconds to minutes, where I wasn't sure if I was breathing. That was what the fearfulness was about. I wasn't sure if some of these experiences were real or not. So you then kind of get into the states where there's like almost like you don't know what's going on in these other states, and that's where this disorientation can come from. And then this is the very last slide, which is this idea in the state of kind of pureness, pure perception, so samadhi, and you have the physiological and cognitive functions of the body and mind. But what role does the social context play if you're in these states? There's a certain personal narrative that you have before going into these states and when you come out again. There's certain cultural belief systems that kind of make meaning of these states. And we know that practices such as suggestion, hypnosis, and placebo have an incredible effect of what meditation does. And arguably, these have a pretty strong effect on the emergent experiences. So maybe meditation isn't all that kind of innate. Maybe it's much more kind of externally influenced state. And then my supervisor and the teams in our department, like there's Tanya Lerman, who's an anthropologist, but then Mike Lifshitz has written about hypnosis, and then Lawrence Kermai, he does a lot of like culture influenced psychiatric conditions. All these suggest that there's a big cultural framing of what we do with these states. And so while I think this is a very smooth story of what jhanas are and concentrating the mind, think back at the very beginning when I spoke about this idea that these are the magic jhanas, evoking certain magical states. And now I come to Asia thinking that I know what jhanas are for people in North America. And it feels like the floor is just ripped under my feet because there's a different framework of what it means afterwards. They take different meaning of these states into the world afterwards. And I think there's a really interesting question. On the one hand, figure out how does this unification work, this absorption? But then there's this other really interesting question, like once you emerge out of that, once the posterior distribution reemerges, how do you reconstruct it? And there seems to be not a natural process, but I think it might be an innate process of the unification. It might be much more difficult to think about this reemergence, and that's the important part because at the end we want to have panya, wisdom, and shila. We want to act like we have a wholesome life, and that might be when we need to kind of move outside of the neuroscientists and look to anthropologists and kind of cultural psychiatrists and look at these other practices. Maybe they have an influence in even getting into these states, but they definitely have a meaning in how we get out of these states once we're done. So yeah, if insight is the art of mastering the way of looking, then all these things are definitely a big part of mastering that. And that's me in the past 2-3 months while I was in Asia, trying to make sense of this all, sometimes with a bit of success, sometimes a bit more challenge than success. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was a real treat. I'm sure there are lots of questions, both online. If you have a question online, Kat will be monitoring you. Just raise your hand. I think we'll start in the room. Anybody wants to start off? I'm sure there are questions. There's one there. Yes, please.
Thanks, Jonas, for talk. You mentioned quite a bit throughout that you collected some neurophysiological data. What exactly are you going to be doing with that, and how does that relate to the models we talked about?
Well, that's one of the big questions why I'm here right now to speak with Mort and others. The idea is to figure out what are kind of pure states of the brain. And I think one really promising approach is the one that Celan has offered with the harmonics of the brain, that neurophysiological activity, although we just spoke about it before the talk, although very complex, can probably be decomposed in a few basic kind of harmonies that are going on in the brain. And so while in usual experience, they all overlap, leading to very rich phenomenological content, maybe they reduce to simple harmonies. So we would probably use some sort of harmonic analyses, connectum harmonics, and figure out that do these different jhanas resemble discrete harmonics that change from jhana to jhana? And are these states where the decomposition is not into very many different harmonics, but into just a very single few harmonics? And then the other approach that I hope to do with this data is to think about the kind of hierarchical ordering of the brain. Because if I so loosely speak about the predictive dynamics of different assumptions that we hold, possibly these different assumptions are encoded in different brain areas. So these different brain areas have a certain influence on different part of experience. And the ideal scenario is that we would be able to decode these different brain areas and make a model and the causal strength of influence that these models have on the emergent phenomenology, and see that there's maybe a few areas that are associated to computing, and maybe affect, emotion, joy, that these start to dominate the systems while others reside in the background. So that would be the two analyses that I think are most interesting, and that would be maybe some of the kind of Morton's whole brain models. There's some Carl Friston developed these DCMs that allows to do this with a few nodes, and then there's a bunch of just simpler markers, right? Like maybe even residing in breathing rates is indicative of certain jhanas. We collected skin data, so maybe an increase in skin conductance is a really good indicator for this arising of pity. And the truth is that, maybe I should have mentioned them, there's 2 studies on jhanas out there, but they're usually with very small sample sizes. And so it's very new territory that we're embarking on here. And so it's a very explorative approach. And pretty much the idea is whoever has methods that might be interesting here, that we would love to kind of have them chime in and figure out what's going on here. Yeah, Fernando.
Two questions. This idea of the narrowing of the posterior, is that the first jhana or all of them? Because could that be happening at different layers in the hierarchy? So you have further narrowing in the third, lower, and then start going up.
So I think this general idea of the narrating of the posterior is probably something that happens throughout all jhanas. And there's probably something where it kind of narrows more and more over the jhanas. I kind of left it as a single dimension. I don't yet know what this kind of stronger and stronger narrowing down means. I just thought maybe it's just increase of narrowing, but you might be right, because certain ideas in the first 4 jhanas still have concepts of space and time and consciousness. So there's definitely not narrowing going on. So yeah, I think that might be exactly what's going on, that you still have pretty distributed functioning posterior in some either hierarchies, or if you get away from the hierarchy ideas of some brain networks that still compute certain parts, while other parts start to fade more and more. And then there's a continuous fading up to the most complex layers. I love that, yeah.
And maybe question based on that. So in the beginning, you were talking in a very computational cognitive way, that you're looking to the rows and you want to see it as clearly as possible. And emotions, another, I might think you should put them out. And then when you start talking about jhana, the first jhana is about that, but then the second is okay, let's forget about this thing that you're looking at. And it seems first half of the jhanas is more about emotions and valence and something, and then the later half is more about perceptual a priori.
Yeah.
So something very non-cognitive. So do you think those things could also feed into the modeling?
Well, so how I think of it is that, like, I think it definitely does, and I think it would be super interesting to mold it in. I probably don't have a much better answer than the intuition that you already have, but the thought is, I think, from what these practitioners tell is that you try to have endogenously caused attentional objects, and it just happens that these emotional states are the strongest endogenous experiences that you have. So focusing on joy is just a very easy one. Like focusing on like very deep calmness is just, it's such a subtle experience that you need to quiet your mind a lot. So how it's often displayed is that all these factors are always present. You could always focus on them, but there's just too much mind chattering going on. So in order to be able to even notice these subtle kind of, I would call them all somewhat cognitive functions, to notice these subtle cognitive functions, you just need to kind of quiet the mind of all other things. And so that's like why there's a progression, like from like more complex into more subtle and subtle cognitive functions. Yeah.
Really incredible. I enjoyed it. On the analysis of planets, you've got this incredibly rich EEG data, and you want to sort of learn or discover some mapping between that and subjective.
Yeah.
Theory. But on the other side, you said actually it's quite hard to collect rich subjective data. That's hard in the first place, but in this population hard as well. So how, this isn't unique to this.
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
So the one advantage that we have here over the psychedelic space is that there's thousands of years of literatures written about like Buddhists love to make maps. So we can just take all these maps and kind of take them as face value and say, like, if you would say them, jhana, well, then they're probably on these states. It's not as simple because, as said, that jhanas mean many different things, and each person does it a bit different. And even if we speak with a teacher and we're like, okay, now we know what the teacher thinks, and then we speak with the students and they all have like subtle differences. And they probably have a difference in their experience in their neurophysiology. And so there's like what we end up doing in the end is that we have like brief questionnaires that they had a little button. So like we do have the assumption that these jhanas are discrete. Like possibly you could have like a little knob and you just turn it and like how deep the jhana is. It's probably a bit too distracting, and we look for practitioners that describe the jhanas as not continuous but discrete, which tends to be the more experienced practitioners. And then we asked them afterwards to we thought about the most important ratings, which is like the depth of the jhana, how occluded you are, how far away from sensory experience you are. So we use that to then kind of just rate each of the jhana blocks that we have a bit of a difference. But of course, it's reducing a rich phenomenology into a few scalars.
Even that is more than I thought you had, because you said that some people wouldn't talk about them. So
well, so that's why most of many of our practitioners are lay people, and we try to find the most experienced lay people in these monasteries. With these monks, it's a bit more difficult. We need to figure that out. At the moment, we ask them to just do the deepest concentration that they can do, expecting that is jhana. But there is, of course, a lot of ambiguity there. And then what we do at the end is we do these 2.5, 3 hour long phenomenological interviews with people. It's a mixture of like anthropology and microphenomenology, just understand what's the lived experience of these people in these states. And that we can then use those to understand like what does a 3 mean for this participant and to another participant. But I do agree it's one of the big challenges in the field, and something that I think has a lot of potential in refining data and getting rid of a bunch of noise. Yeah.
Great talk. I do have a question, but we have one question online, so I'll let that go first.
Cool.
Kenneth, if you want to unmute yourself, it should hopefully work from your laptop.
Yes. Can you guys hear me? Yes.
Oh, wait, I know what I need to do.
Not yet.
Wait, I need to.
Ines has temporarily been silenced.
No, he's trying to thought transference.
Microphone.
Maybe.
How about this?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. First, I just wanted to say that was a beautiful talk. I really appreciated the infusion of Buddhist theory into your presentation, and your motivations for researching this really came through very clearly. I'm one of Morton's PhD students, and I'm sad I can't be there because it seems like we're interested in almost exactly the same things. My question is about translating the theory into practice. I find a lot of these ideas about attractor landscapes and the Bayesian brain very compelling, but it's also hard to know exactly how to test these models. For example, I was recently meeting with a neuroscientist at Oxford who specializes in these, autoencoder and Bayesian brain approaches, but focuses on like really concrete problems like, action selection in mice, where you have, very clearly defined priors and posteriors. But when it comes to things like meditation, what we're interested in are transforming deep beliefs, right? It's unclear how exactly to model that. And same with the attractor landscape, like what exactly are the attractors? So how do you, how are you thinking about testing these models?
I'll try answering that as a second thing. But the first thing is what you kind of speak about this idea that we expect that these jhanas are able to not only change phenomenology, but change like fundamental beliefs and change our, like basically generate insight. There's a big kind of caveat and assumption that I make is I kind of take it as somewhat as face value that these practices are able to do it. What I think would be really cool is to have some insight task, like some, and it's hard to find a good task, but there's like these matchstick problems, and you give it and you ask people like, do you know which matchstick to move to like solve this thing? Maybe that's insight in a certain way. And like, can we show that these people are actually better in that? Like ideally, imagine if we would have such a task that actually represents insight in a meaningful way. And if you could give that to each of the practitioners and use that as a scalar, it's a bit of like an objective scale of like how insight generating are these practices actually. Because there is a problem that some people are really good in bringing about these phenomenologies, but they don't really get any insight out of those. And other people have really rich insight, but they're not able to master these deep stages. So there seems to be some correlation, but it's not one-to-one. So I think that's a big kind of behavioral question. But then there's this other part of like, how do we measure these? How do we prove these models? I honestly don't know. I don't know. I think that's a bit the edge where the field is at the moment. I think we're now at this big thing of like moving from kind of a bit of a modular idea of the brain to like whole brain dynamic idea. We start being in the early phases of developing whole brain models to even get somewhere that there's probably something set to like then kind of have whole brain models that are actually mapping neurophysiology and aren't only like abstract complex models that kind of mirror data. And then there's probably something where maybe kind of brain stimulation or something is like a causal testing mechanism between the two. Or the other big thing is I think once we have these models, then we could actually start making hypotheses based on these models about other practices. And we could start to design tasks that in silico simulations would evoke certain patterns. It's probably in that space, but I think there's, I'm probably not the best expert in the field. And I think the field is a bit too young to have very clear answers there. Yeah. I wish I had a good answer, but
No. I mean, just follow up briefly on that. Like there are some interesting behavioral paradigms that are being used on meditation practitioners, like for example, attentional blindness. I'm not sure if you've looked into this, but where you can mask a stimulus basically, and based on how much you're paying attention, you might see the object. You might have a memory of the object before it's masked, or you might not. And so those are quote unquote objective ways of assessing progress in meditation. But again, it's hard to link that back into the theoretical framework. But thank you so much again for the talk. It was really wonderful.
Maybe the two things that I can say on that is that when we collected our data is the two measures where we actually used a bit more, like not just resting state data, but just tasks, is that we have people going through these jhana states using a hierarchical oddball task. So it's a hierarchical auditory oddball task. The idea is you have like this bap, 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 bap. So you have the oddball at the end, but then like you have this oddball many times, and sometimes you have just bap, 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 with no local oddball, but this global oddball. And so there the idea is that some of these model meditations suggest that the kind of monitoring of experience in these abstract layers that kind of is reduced, that you're more in the moment. So we would expect that the evoked mismatch negativity of the global oddball starts to fade first, and that in deep jhana, possibly even the local oddball starts to fade. So I think that's one of the tasks where we have a very strong behavioral hypotheses, where we have a very clear measure, which is the kind of mismatch negativity response, and where we now could even start looking at whole brain models and think like, what is the brain state that the brain is in during the phase that is associated to a very small mismatch negativity response. So I think that's where then kind of behavioral paradigms start to match really, really interesting. And this other thing that we started to do is that the psychedelic spaces, of course, there's this idea of like brain plasticity. And this question is like, is the brain actually able to learn and like, is the brain better in absorbing new information? And so one really interesting task is the long-term potentiation task, which should I, maybe I'll just show it. So in the bottom row, right, you have these circles that either have like vertical or horizontal or vertical lines. And the idea is that you flash these circles in like a rate of like 1 hertz, so once per second. And you just see, does the horizontal or vertical line have a stronger evoked response in the visual cortex? And then what you do is then you flash them with about 10 hertz, which is the tetanizing frequency, which in mice and also in human has shown that if you flash it, there's a certain encoding happening where the brain starts to be more receptive for that orientation. And then you go back and flash it with 1 hertz. And what happens is that the tetanized orientation leads to a stronger evoked response. And this effect is stronger, like the strength of this effect is a kind of an indicator for the plasticity of the brain. And so we did this paradigm at the very first day of the retreat and at the very last day of the retreat, with the hypothesis that jhana meditation can induce this plasticity of a 10-day meditation retreat. We don't know if you find something yet. It's the task, like this task seemed to be sensitive to psychedelic induced changes, but then of course psychedelics, they're like pharmacologically induced changes. They're much, much stronger than behaviorally induced changes. But if it's possible behaviorally induced, I think these jhana meditators might be the ones that are most promising.
Sorry, can I just get clarification? I don't actually know what you mean by tetanizing frequency.
Oh, so tetanizing frequency, it's just it doesn't mean anything else but showing is like flashing a stimulus with 10 hertz.
Right.
And there's something interesting going on where this 10 hertz flashing, we don't exactly know, but probably due to like the kind of 10 hertz alpha like alpha power bands in the visual cortex, leads to a certain encoding of that frequency, that you start to become more sensitive to this. It's not the same, but it's a bit similar to an after image. If you look at a certain shape for a long time, and if you flash the shape, it gets even stronger. Then afterwards you have like a subtle after image of that. That's a little bit what it means with these circles. And the more plasticity there is, the stronger this effect is. Yeah, thanks for the questions, Kana.
Thank you.
My question is broader and about your last slide. You talked about the cultural relevance and those types of things. And obviously meditation is very deeply rooted in specific cultures. It has hundreds of years of tradition. But do you have any ideas about how you would like to explore the importance of culture and setting and surroundings relating to this?
Yeah, so the interesting and unique set about our data at the moment is that we have this like meditation retreat with practitioners in North America. And now we start to have data with people in the Asian context. So there's like a very obvious, like you could just compare the neurophysiological activity between the two. There's probably a few more other variations going on. Next time we go back, we also want to go to a retreat in Asia that we have the exact same traditions. They're trained by the exact same teacher, by the exact same lineage. And now you can kind of just have this cultural comparison like a group design. But now we also have these interviews, and these interviews are interesting, where we now work with anthropologists and we do this cross-cultural comparison. Like Tanya Lerman has done this huge study where she compared charismatic Christian prayers in like 5 or 6 different cultures around the world. And we start to do the same with jhana, to just speak with people like, how does it feel to be in jhana? What's the meaning? What do you get out of jhana? And what we found so far is that when people describe the moment-to-moment experience, it's very similar across these different cultures. There's like with this very like strong focus and unification. So on the other hand, when we start to ask people about the meaning and the larger impact of these practices, they start to embed them in very different metaphysical kind of frameworks. That's not true for all. Like, of course, in the Western world, there's people that have a very like kind of like religiously inspired worldview, and in the Asian world, there's people that have a very kind of wide Western kind of scientific perspective. But there seems to be a bit of a tendency in these two directions. And now, like what we can ask at the moment from the neurophysiological level is only to see if there's differences. It would be interesting to have a bit more like culturally primed tasks that get at these things, but we don't have any specific tasks there at the moment. So we rely mostly on these interviews, the cross-cultural comparison. Yeah.
Okay, well, if I, oh no, no, please.
If this time,
No, please.
yeah, look, Jonas, it was an amazing talk. Really appreciate the work that you're doing in gathering this data. I mean, it's invaluable. It's very difficult to get this super, I would say, the Olympic athletes of jhana meditators. And that's, I could ask so many questions, but I think I'll focus on that aspect, which is what you brought up. That these are these side of our type of tradition, the Sudhimagga jhanas are probably so intense and specific, they're perhaps not accessible to most people. And basically, I'd like to rehearse the jhana wars between the sort of more traditional sutta jhanas, the ones that are more accessible and actually have a very similar phenomenology to the extreme, like powerful Visuddhimagga jhanas. So one thought, and I just wonder how you see this, is that as you kind of really put out there, the purpose of the jhanas is in the Buddhist idea is so that we can have a certain amount of concentration and clarity and awareness to then get some insights into the nature of our experience. And so the analogy is often used, I think it's a good one in a sense, of a microscope. So, you know, a normal mind is like, imagine if you're just trying to see something on a busy moving train and trying to see like some plant and trying to see the cells. Then you're not going to see cells. So you need a microscope. And if you get a good enough microscope and it's kind of still, you know, maybe a microscope that was there 150 years ago, 200 years, you know, you'd be able to see the cells and like say, oh, look, all life is made of cells. This is the insight. Now, these kind of Visuddhimagga jhanas are like making an electron microscope. Okay, it's kind of not necessary. And I mean, I'm one for the sort of the sutra jhanas. You know, let's do what's accessible to a lot of people and, you know, people can get into. Now, there is a certain marvelousness, like Olympic athletes, of being able to get into the electron microscope territory and, like, you know, narrow it. Two questions, I guess, around this. One is that how you see it, or do you think that there really is something more of insights possible if you get such powerful jhana? And second of all, could this become like a goal in itself, and people get caught up in the power of these jhanas, which is so powerful that they can induce, I'm going to be like, you know, playing on what you said, induce altered priors or even delusional priors, and that's with inverted commas from a Western perspective.
I love those. Thanks for bringing those up into such central points. Maybe I'll start with the second one. Can these practices become addicting and even harmful? And they definitely can be. There's a big warning in these scriptures that people can get stuck, and especially the fourth jhana. In the Asian context, I heard many people speak about the fourth jhana as the magic jhana. Like that's when you get these magical powers of being able to travel, take your soul out of the body, travel in different dimensions, read other people's minds. And that's incredibly attractive. And then, like we talked about, these qualities that are really beautiful. And there is this risk of people starting to practice them for these things, getting stuck on that outcome. The teachers I worked with, however, both North America and Asia, were very clear that that is not the goal of what you do. And they're very cautious in warning their students and getting their students out of it. They still use them, and they still invite students to find these things amazing. And finding them amazing and really wanting to master them is probably a really good skill in getting into them. It's kind of the energy that generates energy, motivation to get into them. Well, at some point you need to let go of it. And that's why it's probably valuable to have a certain teacher that can monitor that. While if there's not a teacher, you might just get stuck in weird local minima there that aren't really beneficial. And that links back to your first question, which is like, do we need these deep Visuddhimagga jhanas? Aren't they way too much? Aren't they like sutta subtle jhanas? Or like even just good concentration, isn't it more than sufficient? Similarly put, a criticism that I sometimes heard here is this idea, well, isn't the whole point of jhana pointless because you're just in this empty space? Why do you want to empty your mind of experience? And then the things like emptiness, which is this Buddhist thing, it's not nothingness. Emptiness is seeing the non-detachment to like the richness of life, being like fully in touch with life. And I didn't find this to be true when I spoke to these jhana practitioners. They very much emphasized that they are vipassana practitioners. They want to change the relationship to the objects out there in the world. And so the question, I think, is just like, how do you balance the two? And I think the kind of sutta jhanas, the more subtle jhanas, their idea is I train concentration a little bit. Maybe I don't even need jhana. If jhana comes, great. If jhana shmana doesn't come, I don't need it. So like a beautiful friend, Mark Miller, who keeps saying this sentence. I love it. So you concentrate, and then you do investigation. You look what's there. And if you look what's there, it becomes easier and easier to concentrate. And then so you concentrate, you notice, oh, this fear that distracts me from concentration, it's actually not that bad. I can deal with it. And once that is, it becomes easier to concentrate. And you concentrate, and then there's the next hindrance coming up, and then you investigate it, and it's like, I'm so distracted that my friend is waiting, but I actually checked in with him, and like, he's okay waiting a little bit. So that's okay. And so you have this forth and back between concentration. There's hindrances coming up, you deal with them, and then you can dive deeper and deeper and deeper. So that's one approach. And this other approach that that in the kind of more Park Sayadaw tradition that I heard is like, well, that's okay, but there's a much faster way. And I think this is the thing where I don't know which way is faster. It might be a very personalized difference, but there is the idea that you just waste time doing all these investigations. Once your concentration is super sharp, it takes no effort. Like once you're so sharp and then you look around, you just see, you don't even need to do any investigations because your microscope is so good that you don't even need to interpret any hazy data. It just becomes super crystal clear what experience is actually made out of. So the end point is very similar of these two practices. So I think that's one story. And then the question is, do you get more and more fundamental insights? And that's definitely what these Park Sayadaw people claim, where there's like, without practicing attention so much, there's a certain level of assumptions that will never penetrate. Like maybe penetrating the idea of that space and time is made up. Maybe you're able to penetrate those. And for most people, the idea that space and time is not it's kind of a made up experiential thing, that's already really bending it a lot. But what if there's more subtle levels? Like what if there's even assumptions that are even there? What if you could penetrate those? And the other idea is to penetrate those, you need to have stronger concentration. And I can speak of that experientially. that's like far out territory and might only be very few people who can do these practices. But the way how they speak about it is that there's definitely, they have that penetration. If that's valuable for life, I don't know. I lift my hands to that, but that's the narratives I heard around it.
This has been enlightening, I may say. Wonderful. We spoke of many things, and you spoke of many things today. But one of the things we ended up talking about was what happened to Buddha after he'd gone into those jhanas. You mentioned that one of the reasons why he was doing this was not so much for the jhanas in and of themselves, but how those jhanas could change the world. How, having experienced these things, really, that flourishing, those nothingness, emptiness, how that would allow him to come back into the world. And I guess ultimately that's what matters, yes? I mean, this is why we're here talking about it. I mean, these are important experiential states that we can enter from time to time. But what matters is what we do with the time that has been allotted. And what matters to us is how we deal with the rest of the world, right? We go inside, but then we come out and we engage. And I think one of the exciting things about here today is that you've given us some tools to start to think about that very process. We are hoping that we can help you actually use scientific tools to try to map those kind of changes that we see, because of course, as you already alluded to, what it does seem as if we have an alphabet. By going in and using the jhanas, we may have an alphabet for those kind of mixed states that we feel all the time, whether we are Olympic athletes or just people that like to do parkour, right? Which of course is what we did on Saturday. But I think overall, I think this has been wonderful. I think for those of you in the room, we'll go and have the usual kind of pleasures of life. But for those who are online and everybody else, thank you again so much.